Joining me today for Coffee with Cornelius is philosophy professor Ben Burgis, who appears on the Michael Brooks show in a segment called Debunk. He is the author of the book, Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left from Zero Books, which I will link to in the description below. He also writes for Jacobin, Quillette, and Aereo. Ben is a democratic socialist and has taken on the arguments of some of the right's most beloved figures, including Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Stefan Molyneux, Ben Shapiro, using logic, that catchphrase of conservatives. We're going to talk about why logic is not a monopoly of the right, and we'll also get into Ben's specific critiques of certain conservative figures. Ben, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Cornelius.
Thank you. I'd like to start broad, and then we'll get into specific issues. There's a claim that logic is useless or just silly, since what matters ultimately is crafting a compelling narrative. Essentially, which side of the debate tells a better story? How would you respond to this?
Well, I think which side of the debate tells a better story is really important, right? I mean, I do think we should care about how we rhetorically package our arguments, but I think the arguments themselves matter for a couple reasons. One of them is that if some, sometimes the purpose of an argument isn't even to convince the other side; it's literally just to try to figure out what's true.
Right.
And certainly rhetoric by itself isn't going to help you do that. But secondly, people do change their minds because they've heard what they regard as good reasons to think something. This happens all the time. I'd be surprised and fascinated, honestly. Like if anybody listened to this couldn't think of an example where they changed their mind about something and they at least thought that they had some sort of good reason to do so, right? So what you're doing what logic is just looking at an argument, in other words, at things that are presented as reasons for believing things and seeing when that really provides a good reason and when it doesn't. And even if obviously humans are complicated, we're a narrative species, it does matter a lot how you package these things. But the claim that people don't respond at all to arguments just seems wildly overstated. And, I think this needs to be a tool of persuasion that we use, not the only one, but certainly one of them. And in particular, I think that when people are getting a lot of mileage on the right out of saying, oh, hey, I've got this argument and you haven't told me what's wrong with it. You can call me a bigot and this and that, but that's not an argument, as one of these guys likes to say. Then if you never actually do get around to saying what's wrong with the argument, then it's a bad look. If you're interested in thinking about narratives, that reinforces the enemy's narrative.
Right. So there's a claim among the right, speaking of narratives, that monopoly of logic is on the right, that this monopoly of logic is on the right. So Ben Shapiro says something like, facts don't care about your feelings, implying that, of course, that he has the facts and the left has the feelings. Is this really true? To what extent is it true?
Yeah. So the germ of truth maybe is that there are people on the left who, even though, of course, like everybody, they do actually take themselves to have reasons for thinking that things they think are true, and they sometimes give these reasons to others. Nobody entirely neglects arguments. But the germ of truth is there are people on the left who have learned to roll their eyes when they hear certain kinds of logic talk, or especially talk about logical fallacies, because they're used to associating that language with people they see as disingenuous and kind of ridiculous. So whereas on at least parts of the right, it's much more valorized. So that's true, right? I mean, that's what I'm trying to correct. But certainly the idea that there's any kind of monopoly on the right on making good arguments or caring about good arguments is obviously false. I mean, I think if you look at like what somebody like Noam Chomsky has done for decades, where he'll sort of, like really calmly, meticulously, take apart like the stated rationale for some U.S. intervention somewhere, and he'll he'll find things in the official documents, where they'll say something that indicates that there's another agenda, and he'll really like draw it out in a pretty extreme way. Whereas really, almost any of the, like, sticking to that example, right, U.S. foreign policy, almost any of the sort of defenders of American empire on the right are just vastly more superficial than that. Or
Absolutely.
yeah,
So what happened?
and
I'd like to
yeah.
ask now, that seemed to be a province of the left, right? This focus on
Mm-hmm.
calm, reasoned, logical
Mm-hmm.
debate. And at least on a surface level, at least the way the media portrays it and the way things are portrayed on YouTube or on social media, it looks like the right has this monopoly. When did things start to change?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, so for example, you know, I sort of think of, there's a classic television exchange from the late 60s. There was a documentary about it called Best of Enemies, between Gore Vidal, and William F. Buckley, uh, and where they're arguing about Vietnam and other things. And certainly in that case, right? I mean, like, Vidal is the picture of cool and collected, and Buckley literally loses it, and
Yeah.
tells him, um, you call me a Nazi again, you effing queer, I'm going to punch you in the face, so that's, and certainly the way that the right would like to portray it, that's completely flipped. That people on the left are always the Buckley in that scenario now, right?
Yeah.
And they're the Vidal in that scenario. Um, and again, it's certainly not entirely true. I mentioned Chomsky. I think, like Nathan Robinson, who's the editor of Current Affairs, he'll write these incredibly detailed, intricately argued, like 10,000 word,
Hmm.
takedowns of people, well, like Ben Shapiro, who was mentioned in the previous question, like Charles Murray, etc. Um, so there are people for sure who are doing that work, but I think it is true that, like, this image of the left, or elements of the left, as just sort of moralistically yelling at people and not bothering with arguments, didn't come out of nowhere. It's not entirely a concoction of the right. Um, there are definitely germs of truth to it. Like, so for example, on a lot of the left, you get this taboo about, like, platforming bad people by arguing with
Hmm.
them. That, oh, you can't platform such and such, by even like
Yeah.
having a debate with them. Uh, and that certainly feeds into it. We could talk about other things that feed into it. And so I think these are real things that really do happen. And I guess the larger question is why they happen. Um, and that's something I try to get into, and other things I've read more recently. But I think a big part of this answer is what I kind of think of as the pathologies of powerlessness. That, in other words, it's been so long since anything to the left of just liberalism really had any kind of role in mainstream politics. That,
Hmm.
if you think about, uh, somebody like, Bernie Sanders in the U.S. or Jeremy Corbyn in the U.K., for most, these are not young men, and for most of their careers, they were, you know, maybe they had a congressional seat, or, in Bernie's case, for a couple decades, or seat in parliament in Corbyn's, but these were extremely marginal figures, right? And
Yeah.
they were very unusual figures. So even like serious social democrats like that, it's been very long since they've been allowed anywhere near the levers of real world power. And certainly the labor movement has been in decline for decades, for a lot of reasons, that we could get into. And it's also the case, and certainly in terms of any more like radical transformative ideas about how we could change, like, the structure of society, um, certainly back in like the 90s, there was a widespread feeling that that was just over now because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Um, Margaret Thatcher's phrase, Tina, there is no alternative, like really captured a lot of that zeitgeist. And a lot of that is started to change, right? It's slowly, right? But it's starting to change. But I think that during the time in which the left was in this kind of exile from like real world political influence, I think there are a lot of things. There's a certain extent to which if you knew that you weren't going to take power, but you could at least take a moral stand, right?
Sure.
You could at least sort of say loudly and clearly, I'm against all these horrible things that are going on. And I think a lot of the bad habits that were formed in that era are still present on today's left, that we tend to think still in many ways of politics more in terms of what it says about you as a person, that you're taking this kind of stand, rather than about trying to win over the broadest possible layer of people in order to actually have an influence in the real world. Because for so long that just wasn't on the table. And I think that things like, I'm going to show exactly how much I despise this idea by not even engaging with it, is a symptom of that mindset.
I see. So let's turn the gears a little bit and talk now more broadly about logical fallacies, which is something you talk about in your book, which is Logic for the Left. A logical fallacy essentially occurs when an argument's conclusions do not follow readily from its premises, or is just logically wrong. So what are, would you say, 3 common logical fallacies that public intellectuals regularly fall prey to? I'm talking about people like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson and so on.
Yeah. So one big one that I see a lot is tu quoque, which is the appeal to hypocrisy is another name for that, where you say that, my opponent says such and such, right? But look at how they don't act like such and such is true, or they said something else that doesn't really fit together with it, right? Therefore they're wrong. And this is a fallacy, right? It's a mistake that we make in reasoning. It's something that looks like a reason to think that somebody's wrong, but it really isn't, for a couple of reasons. One is, even in the best version of this move, where you're saying that somebody actually has one idea that's inconsistent with some other idea that they hold, that tells you that they must be wrong about one of them, but it doesn't tell you which one.
Yeah.
And it's even worse when you get, this person is, they have this idea, but it's supposedly inconsistent with their behavior. Now, oftentimes when people say this, the things that they cite aren't actually, like there's no actual inconsistency there at all, right? Like it's just kind of silly stuff. You say you're a socialist, but you own an iPhone, that sort of thing, right? Which I always wonder if it would be equally hypocritical in their eyes for a Soviet dissident in the 80s to eat food that was grown at a collective farm, or use a phone for that matter that was manufactured in a nationalized factory. But even when they are right, even when you really are being hypocritical in some way, one, that doesn't necessarily show that you don't really believe what you're saying, right? It could just be weakness of will. I mean, we're all imperfect, and and all of us do things that don't necessarily live up to our ideals. I think that's just being human. And two, even if you do help yourself to that assumption that this means that somebody is saying something they don't really mean, that by itself doesn't mean that they're wrong, right? That and this is a really important point, because I think something that ties into what we were talking about in the answer to the last question is, something I see far too often on the left, is this obsession with whether or not somebody is acting in good faith or bad faith. That okay, are they a good faith interlocutor? Are they really sincere about what they're saying, or are they insincere or just trying to score points or whatever? And think about that as, first of all, that actually evaluating that. I mean, sometimes it's obvious, fair enough, but oftentimes it seems to involve this kind of mind reading that you can't really do anyway, right? That you're going to peer into your opponent's heart and see what their motivations are. But second, even if somebody is acting in bad faith, even if they're being completely insincere about what they're saying, that doesn't necessarily tell you anything about whether they've got a good argument or a bad argument.
So it destroys the credibility of the person, but not the credibility of the argument per se. It doesn't tell you anything about the argument itself.
Yeah, exactly. People who are heartbreakingly sincere can make terrible arguments, right? People who are just acting like a mob lawyer trying to come up with something, right? Could actually make a good point. So that's tu quoque, right? That's the appeal to hypocrisy. One that's a little bit more esoteric, but that I do see a lot, is the Continuum Fallacy, which is the logical leap from there's a vague border between two things, it's not quite clear where you draw the line, to therefore there's no distinction between those two things at all. There aren't clear cases on both sides of wherever the line is. So, I mean, really, actually, this one I see all over the place, right? Like pretty much anytime you hear somebody use the phrase, where do you draw the line? I think you should at least suspect that they're engaging in this form of reasoning.
Right. So, for example, if somebody says to you that I would like free healthcare, or at least government-provided healthcare, and then you say, but where do you draw the line in that leading towards a socialist or a fascist state? Would that be an example of that kind of reasoning?
Like, or if maybe they were pushing that kind of argument, right? Like, like so a related thing that your example, maybe the way you presented it, right, sounds a little bit more like it's like a slippery slope fallacy, right? If you do this, you have to do this, and then you have to do this, you have to do this, right? But like, but yeah, I mean, like if somebody said, "Oh, I think I think there should be free healthcare," and you say, "Well, okay, but what about this or that or the other thing, right? Should that be free? What's the difference?" And of course, oftentimes when people say that, right, my reaction to their examples is yes, absolutely, right? Like,
sure,
but sometimes, sure, like you could get. I'm sure you could get to the point where you say something that even I think is unreasonable, right? That shouldn't be. That just shouldn't be something that's provided as a social service. So you say, oh, great. Now, where do you draw the line? And you come up with examples that are a little bit like that, and a little bit like that, and a little bit like that.
Yeah.
Or like one that I saw a little while ago, Rashida Tlaib, a congresswoman from my home state of Michigan, said that when the movement for a $15 minimum wage first got started, that was reasonable, but given how much time has passed, and even if this went into law today, right, by the time it went fully into effect, $15 certainly wouldn't be what it was in 2012. So really we should be talking about like maybe $18 or $20. And there was this reaction by a lot of conservatives like, yeah, okay, Rashida, so, why stop at 20? Why not 30? Why not 50? Why not $1,000 an hour? And that's just, of course, right, you couldn't, like, you'd have catastrophic economic collapse if you had a $1,000 an hour minimum wage.
Yeah, sure.
So that would be a bad idea. But like, $20 is fine. $21 would be fine, right? Like where exactly you draw the line, right, is incredibly difficult to pin down. But that's true of all kinds of things. Like the classic example of this is you take somebody with a head of hair like mine, you remove a hair every day, right? And then like eventually get to a point where I'm bald. Given the way that we tend to use the word bald, if I had like 3 hairs on my head, we would still think I was bald, right? Like bald doesn't literally mean 0. So 3 hairs is bald, 4 hairs is bald, 5 hairs is bald. Clearly there's some point at which we cross the line to not bald, but I couldn't begin to answer the question of where that is, right?
No,
that's,
of course.
like our language might just be too vague for that to be possible. And if there is an exact right answer, I certainly don't know how to find it. But that doesn't mean that there's no distinction between bald and not bald.
Okay. And what would be the third one?
Sure. Well, actually, so here, let's do this. It's a fun one. So the composition fallacy, is where you say all of the parts of something have some property, therefore the whole thing has that property. So like a kind of toy example you might see in a logic textbook would be all of the molecules that compose the Brooklyn Bridge are invisible, therefore the Brooklyn Bridge is invisible, which gives you the idea. But of course, the reason that's a toy example is that nobody would actually ever make that argument, right?
Sure,
nobody, because it's so, ludicrously obvious the conclusion is false. But here's one that people do make all the time, that the solution to poverty is education. That people say that all the time. Conservatives who are arguing against minimum wage raises saying, we don't need burger flippers to, get more money. It's supposed to just be a temporary job. You should go back to school, right? But even like, centrist liberals say things like this all the time, that there are old clips of Barack Obama saying, the best possible anti-poverty program is education.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is, if it's being suggested that you're not just giving advice to individuals, right? But you're talking about how to solve a structural problem, like how to, what you can do about poverty in general, right? How you could get to a society where you didn't have this big chunk of society that was living in poverty. Then you're committed that exact same composition fallacy as the Brooklyn Bridge. Look, it is often true, right? Not infallibly by any means. Lots of people have lots of barriers to upward mobility, right? But it is true in many individual cases. And I've given this example on the first day of informal logic classes a couple times, and then I sort of do this shtick about how I probably shouldn't tell people this because it's not in my interest to discourage education, but it is true in many individual cases that somebody can go to school and they can maybe get some sort of degree that then leads them to getting a much better job than they would have gotten otherwise. That there are certainly cases of the person who grew up in really hard circumstances and but then they got some sort of scholarship and they went to college and then they went to law school and then they had this like upper middle class life as a lawyer, right? That does happen. But even if we assume for the sake of argument that anybody could do that, which for lots of reasons isn't true, but let's just assume that, right? Like that absolutely anybody could individually do that, right? That the problem then is that it doesn't follow that just because any individual could do this, that every individual could do this. That,
I see.
So the way, in fact, it's not true that every individual could do this, and the way we know it's not true is to say something that right-wingers, love to say to people like me. This is just basic economics, right? Like, if you take the sort of cliched example of telling people they should learn to code, all right, let's say everybody learned to code. Everybody who's living in poverty learned to code. Well, that wouldn't magically create.
Wouldn't that reduce the wages of coders, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. All it would do is, there would still be, most people would not therefore be able to get jobs coders, but the people who did, since their skill would be worth less than the labor market, would just reduce their wages.
Yeah.
And even at an even simpler level, that, like, yeah, sure, if everybody got a college education, it would just reduce the market value of college education. And if just at a really basic level, even if the jobs were somehow available, everybody who's currently, working a job that pays poverty wages couldn't just advance up the economic ladder and get some jobs as a middle-class professional, because if everybody were working as a middle-class professional, then we'd all starve to death because no one would be growing the food.
Sure. Yeah. These are great examples. Now let's get into specifics and specific logical fallacies. I'd like to talk about Jordan Peterson in particular. He's kind of the denizen of the right, if you like, the darling of the right. And you've written that Peterson has a misunderstanding, and this is one of his crucial claims, actually. What are some specific critiques you have of Peterson's understanding of Marxism's relationship to postmodernism?
Yeah. Peterson's understanding of Marxism in relationship to postmodernism, and this is going to sound like a straw man, but I could point you to videos where he just says this, is essentially that postmodernism is like Marxism in disguise. That like he actually sometimes, right? So there have been times where he explicitly says, "Oh, here's the problem that these postmodernists, he claims in one video, were like Marxist student revolutionaries in '68, but then so much information came out about how horrible things were in the Soviet Union that nobody could defend Marxism anymore. So it just took this new form, right? Which is postmodernism." And every part, well, the first thing is every part of that historical narrative is wrong. The big original French post-structuralist thinkers, Derrida and Foucault, had already published books about post-structuralism, and they were like established professors before the '68 student rebellion happened in Paris. That's a very minor footnote, but it bugs me. And the larger problem with this is that he's conflated really three different things. One of them is Marxism with postmodernism, and then he's conflated both of them. He uses these phrases all the time, like postmodern Marxism or postmodern neo-Marxism. He's conflated both of them with a third thing, which is what he would think of as maybe like the excesses of campus SJWdom or something like that. So to start out with Marxism and postmodernism, one of the big defining things, as I understand it, about, this is a very different philosophical tradition, certainly than the one I come from. I'm certainly, all of my background training is in, what's sometimes called analytic philosophy. But as I understand it, postmodernism, one of the sort of core defining things about postmodernism is this rebellion against what postmodernists call grand narratives, right, of history and society that sort of try to assimilate or smooth over all of the complexity, right, of these processes to some like overarching narrative. And not only is Marxism exactly the sort of overarching grand narrative about history and society that these guys were rebelling against, in many cases it was the primary one that they had in mind. Right?
So they were reacting against Marxism in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you watch the YouTuber ContraPoints has a very entertaining video about Jordan Peterson, and in that video, she quotes all of these things that Sartre, who's a French intellectual who actually was a Marxist, and Foucault, who's of course one of the original postmodernists, she sort of quotes all of the things they said about each other, and these guys hated each other, not on a personal level, but intellectually, as far as what they what they stood for. Peterson will sometimes point out that Derrida wrote a book about Marxism, but I'm not sure he's read what's in the book, because in that book, Derrida, he makes a few positive comments about Marxism having like a critical spirit that maybe you could, that maybe should be held on to or something. But, he's very clear that he thinks that as a political project, that's just over. That's just done, right? That's his view. And then the third thing is this kind of perception that this so-called postmodern Marxism, which in the debate that Peterson did with an actual Marxist, Slavoj Žižek, in Toronto, one of the most striking moments in that debate was where Žižek, who's been extremely nice the whole time, right? I think his strategy was that, figured, okay, Peterson attracts a lot of confused young men who aren't necessarily hardened reactionaries. So rather than trying to focus on somehow rhetorically crushing Peterson's skull, he was going to try to
draw people in.
Absolutely. Right. So, but there were a couple of moments that when I think maybe despite himself, right, he did a little bit of what he wasn't trying to do. And one of them was about this question, like there was actually a point in the debate where Zizek just asked him, okay, I hear you talk about postmodern Marxists all the time. Who are you talking about? Give me some names. And Peterson can't come up with anything, which is really striking. But then like when he says this postmodern Marxism thing, is responsible for all of these excesses that, you know, he sees himself as reacting to of campus SJWdom, then that's also a conflation, because first of all, postmodernism, if it's about anything, is about sort of reveling in complexity and ambiguity, and so even if you look at, like, for example, what Foucault said about some of these issues, the idea that, you know, if you're going to be like a gay liberation activist, you're going to say, you know, gay people have a certain collective interest in X, right? Then the immediate instinct of a postmodern thinker like Foucault is going to be to try to complicate that and say, no, it's not all, you know, like they're, you know, you're trying to sort of mash together all these things into this big narrative, right, about collective interest and collective
So there's
struggle.
no hard line between oppressed and oppressor, and there's no hard line between left and right in a postmodern sense. Is that fair to say?
And I mean, and I don't want to do what, you know, Peterson's doing and simplify everything that all these guys have said, right? You know, because I think there are people who are influenced by this tradition in one way or another who wouldn't necessarily go this far, right? But certainly somebody like Foucault, the idea there's no hard line between oppressor and oppressed is actually one of his big, one of his big themes, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that it's all fluid, and it's even worse when you try to equate everything that Peterson is complaining about with Marxism, because while it's certainly true that you know, Marxists have historically been sympathetic to you know, to attempts to push back against, you know, various sorts of bigotry and prejudice and everything, but the question is, on the other end, okay, what exactly makes all these people you're objecting to Marxists, right? Like because they're certainly not offering any sort of economic analysis or talking about socialism or anything like that, right? So what's Marxist about these people you don't like on college campuses? And what I often find that Peterson fans will do when pressed on this point is they'll say, well, the same way that that Marxists see workers as oppressed by capitalists, it's like that. It's like a neo-Marxism because, you know, feminists will see women as being oppressed by men, or, you know, gay rights activists will see gay people as oppressed by straight people, or something like this. But of course, if you're just going to reduce, like, if you're going to water down that word Marxism to the point where any claim that anybody is oppressed by anybody is Marxism, then Marxism predates the birth of Karl Marx by pretty much all of human history.
Yeah, it becomes a nonsensical term. And essentially, this is surprising because a lot of Jordan Peterson's claims when he's talking politically or talking about stuff on campus comes from this confusion. I think there are serious thinkers on the right, though. I think you'll agree with me. People like Roger Scruton, Robert George do have serious arguments that need to be dealt with seriously. My question is, why do people not read Roger Scruton or Robert George, and why do they instead prefer to read somebody like Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson or Sam Harris, for that matter?
Yeah,
that might be that's a bit of a speculative question, right? It's not a philosophical question, but if you could speculate,
I'll take a shot at it.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. So first of all, I do think that, you know, that people like Scruton do things, say things that should be engaged with. I just want to shout out, I think, an outstanding recent example of what that engagement might look like from my friend Matthew McManus, who has an article in Arc Digital Media from April called, which is basically, it was as an essay about Roger Scruton's book, Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands. So the title of the essay is "Are Leftists a Bunch of Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands?" And I think McManus's response to Scruton is really good. But yeah, like, why is it that probably there are more people contributing money to Jordan Peterson's Patreon that literally know who Roger Scruton is, right? You know, why is that?
I agree.
Well, I think part of the reason is that somebody, you know, like Peterson, and obviously in his case, I think there are a few things going on there because, you know, because he's a self-help guru as well as his, you know, political commentary. But Peterson or Shapiro or Sam Harris, you know, these guys all have a slightly different appeals in terms of their branding, but one thing I think they all have in common that differentiates them from somebody like Roger Scruton, or like, I don't know, like Peter Hitchens, right? Is a British conservative thinker who, I mean, obviously obviously I find a lot of his ideas horrifying. His brother Christopher Hitchens, in his memoir Hitch 22, describes Peter as almost tragically right wing, and says, and referring to one of his books, said that he makes claims and arguments in that book that I felt like I had to wear garlic around my neck to read. But so like obviously I disagree with him about just about everything, right? But I certainly think he's 1,000 times more interesting, right, than any of these people that we're talking about. Right? So why is it that a Roger Scruton? Yeah, very good writer, absolutely, right. Also, not just more interesting intellectually, but like actually like a vastly better writer
than Jordan Peterson. Yeah, I find him quite meandering, to be quite honest. Peterson, I found his book. I read 12 Rules for Life, and I read his. I read his academic work. I couldn't. His academic book Maps.
Maps of Meaning.
I couldn't get through that. I didn't know what was going on. I was just found it completely. Both books I found quite meandering.
Maps of Meaning. If you're confused about what's going on, you should have been able to figure that out because he has all those helpful illustrations.
Yeah, maybe I should have looked at the pictures. I honestly
anybody who's never looked inside that book and who doesn't get the joke, he has these illustrations in it that are I don't even know what to say about them, but like they sort of seem like a combination of something that Rust Cole and True Detective might have like scrawled down, on a piece of paper as he's trying to figure out the connections between things. And I don't even know. It's like they're like, there'll be like an arrow. It's like, Dragon of Chaos, mother figure, sexuality, capitalism. It's like, okay, I don't know what's going on here.
It could just be because I don't know anything about psychology, and
I'd like to take a poll of psychologists and see what they think of it.
Yeah.
But look, I think that all of these guys, right, Peterson, Harris, Shapiro, speak to like a certain kind of culture war appetite in ways that certainly somebody like like Scruton doesn't, and even somebody like Peter Hitchens doesn't. That, in other words, they write things that even if the writing isn't necessarily very good, right? I guess out of those three, right? I guess Harris is probably the best writer, but even if the writing isn't very good, there's like a fairly simple line of thought that you can sort of follow and get down and repeat. Not in Maps of Meaning there isn't, but 12 Rules for Life, there is. And they've also, the fact that these guys tend to be lightning rods for certain kinds of left-wing responses is also part of the appeal, right? Like oh look how triggered everybody is by them, right? Like that's definitely part of it. But also just the fact that they're like speaking in an immediate way to what what people kind of want to hear, that they're not, that like, okay, you like, if Jordan Peterson might talk about postmodern neo-Marxists, whatever that means, right? But like, I think it's fairly easy to sort of read that if you're more sympathetic, than we are, and just think, okay, whatever. He's talking about these like bad, crazy left-wing college people. Mm-hmm. That's fine, right? Good enough, right? Whereas like if you're reading, Scruton, like talking about Jean-Paul Sartre or something, right? Then obviously your first question would be, who's that, right? Then like
it's much more difficult to tackle. That's true.
Yeah. It's much more difficult to tackle, and it's probably not even going to be as satisfying, because like, somebody, especially in the Peter Hitchens example, because even though I'm sure they would deny it, but I think that with these so-called intellectual dark web figures, like Harris, Shapiro, Peterson, um, there's a certain sense that you get reading them that like all that you have to do, right? Like all that we have to do is just sort of like crush these political enemies, that we've got, and
Yeah.
and things will be fine. Whereas these more intellectual conservative thinkers sometimes have this much more tragic worldview that like, well, it's not just that like you sort of mysteriously have these crazy people who are pushing for things that I don't like. And we could just go back to common sense, we'll be good, right? It's that maybe in a long-term sense, everything's kind of going to hell in a handbasket, and that's just much less satisfying to read.
Yeah. Now, I'd like to talk about some of your views, Ben. You are a democratic socialist, I believe. Am I right? Yeah. So this does not mean that you necessarily want to get rid of markets or hierarchies. You've written about this, but you rather want to democratize the economy. What does this mean in practice?
Yeah. So I'd certainly like us to have a vastly less hierarchical economic system, but going back to Jordan Peterson, this sometimes you get this sort of straw man thing that unfortunately some leftists do rhetorically play into about like, oh, you think you can get rid of all hierarchies everywhere? And of course, nobody seriously wants that, right? Like if a hierarchy is just any sort of situation where anybody ever has more power than anybody else, or more really just about anything than anybody else, you've got some sort of hierarchy, then no. I mean, of course you can't avoid that. Nobody thinks that, there should be that like parents and toddlers should have totally equal power. You can walk into the street if you want to. Nobody thinks that we should reorganize basketball tournaments non-hierarchically so there aren't winners and losers. Like that these aren't positions that anybody really takes. And sure, I also think that even concretely, as far as like what a viable form of socialism could look like, if you're just sort of imagining all decisions being made by an eternal mass meeting, so everybody is exercising equal amounts of power, then for a variety of reasons, I don't think that's very realistic and probably not even super appealing. That I've certainly spent enough time of my life that I'm never getting back going to meetings, that the idea of organizing society in such a way that we get to go to meetings all the time.
Oh, so tiresome. Yeah, so tiresome.
Yeah, absolutely, right. I don't want that. I think most people probably don't want that. But that doesn't mean that positions of power that are currently not elected, right? The people who are most affected by decisions made by those people in positions of power don't really have a say in who forms those rules, that we couldn't change that. So what would that concretely mean in practice to change that, right? Because I certainly get a lot of people sort of hear language like I've just used and have an entirely reasonable reaction that I have to lots of other things, right? Like when I sometimes hear people on the left throwing around the language of like abolishing this, that, or the other thing. And I always have a lot of annoying follow-up questions, right? It's like, okay, you're going to abolish this, that, or the other thing. Okay, what replaces it? How exactly would it be different, right? And so I certainly get that impulse. And I've read a couple things for Jacobin that try to, answer some of those questions. So the basic thing that I think to be a socialist in any form that goes beyond social democracy, where by social democracy I just mean, like roughly Bernie Sandersism, right? Like efforts to reform the sort of system that we have right now in ways that would make it more humane, have the people at the top of society have a little bit less power, etc., free healthcare, all that stuff. That if you want to go beyond that to socialism outright, right? Like in other words, socialism as a new system instead of capitalism.
Yeah.
Then to be a socialist of any kind, I think, let's just take it as read, so I don't have to keep saying that all of this is controversial, and I don't think I could say anything about this that some people who call themselves socialists wouldn't disagree with, right? So, but the way I see it, at least, right, so the basic impulse behind socialism is to say that it's objectionable that we have a society where some people have the resources to start businesses, to own businesses, and most other people, most of the time, have no realistic choice except for to go to work for people in the first category, which means that for 8 out of every 16 hours that you're awake, you're submitting to the rule of the person you're working for. They have this pretty extreme degree of power over what you're doing for those 8 hours, and you don't really have any particular power over them, right? You know, that you can organize a union, which is great. Everybody should do that, but that at best takes you to sort of, you know, having a Magna Carta for the monarchy. You know, that you're asserting a little bit of popular power, but you've basically still got arbitrary power in place at the base of the system. So fundamentally, what I would think of as socialism is socializing businesses in one way or another. By socializing them, I just mean taking them to a situation where what I've just described is no longer the case, that it's not the case that you have this division between a class of workers and a class of owners. So what that could mean is either that you take something that is currently a private business, private industry, and you nationalize it, right? You know, you put it under public ownership, which I certainly think is appropriate for, you know, for lots of things actually, right? So even relatively moderate social democrats would say that about health insurance. In Great Britain, even moderate conservatives say that about healthcare, period, right? You know, that like they've got the NHS, most hospitals there are nationalized, and even conservatives don't say they shouldn't do that. But a more controversial example that is at least very clear to me would be the pharmaceutical industry, which, you know, even Britain is private. And I would argue that to a great extent for the last few months, we've all been living through the fallout from the fact that it's a private profit-driven industry, because even after MERS and SARS happened, there wasn't any great effort to research medicine for respiratory diseases, not because, you know, you couldn't reasonably understand that after those two sort of pandemic near misses, this was something that you know was going to keep coming up, that, you know, that it was important, right, to be on top of it, but because that's not great for short-term profit, that, like, you know, that sort of research, right, you know, is it going to have a lot of short-term payoff?
But would the alternative necessarily be better, Ben? And by that, I mean, if you have a state-owned pharmaceutical industry, would they necessarily know to respond to something like SARS and MERS by researching respiratory vaccines, for example, or respiratory drugs that can help to placate the symptoms of the disease?
Yeah, I don't think there's any guarantee of that, but I think that policy decision would have a fighting chance in that system that it really doesn't. When you kind of have to always have an eye on the quarterly profit projections, I think a nationalized pharmaceutical industry would be much better positioned to take that hit if you know, if technocrats within that, you know, who are pushing that got their way, which of course there's no guarantee that there is, right? I mean, like, this is something, we don't want to make it sound like any of this is a panacea, or there won't still be politics and, you know, and arguments about what to do, and all that stuff, right? So I think that's a good example for that. But then if you sort of try to learn from what's worked and what hasn't worked in past attempts to do like economy-wide economic planning, like the Soviet Union. The Soviet planning system, Bhaskar Sankar in his book Socialist Manifesto, probably not originally him, I have no idea, right? I don't remember, but you know, uses this phrase about how the Soviet planned economy was like all thumbs and no fingers. In other words, it was very good at certain kinds of things, like pushing out lots and lots of heavy industrial machinery very quickly. That, you know, where you just kind of have to, it's just sort of about volume, and thank God for it, right? Because that meant that they had lots and lots of tanks, you know, and that's part of the reason that Hitler lost the war, right? So that's a good thing. But matching up production of consumer goods with people's needs, right?
Sorry, could you just say that last part again?
Yep. Famously, it was not great for matching up production of consumer goods with people's preferences, preferences of citizens. So, so this is the kind of cliche about the Soviet economy, that like you have these rubles in your pocket you could theoretically spend, but you have like empty grocery store shelves, or the things you want aren't there, or they're full of things that you don't want or need. And of course, it's all very well to say, no, but we're democratic socialists, right? We would have, the Soviet Union was extremely undemocratic. We would have democracy, but that by itself doesn't really get you to where you want to go, because if you sort of imagine the Soviet economic system, you sort of layer parliamentary democracy onto the top of it. So you had free speech and a free press and real multi-party elections. And then I guess whatever party had a parliamentary majority could form the government and appoint the head of the Soviet planning office, Gosplan. Okay, that would have been better than what existed in the Soviet Union. I'm quite sure of that. Like you wouldn't have seen some of the worst atrocities, of that system. But I don't necessarily know that a version of Gosplan whose head was appointed by a democratic government would have done any better as far as these questions about consumer products. Maybe there are some people who argue that advances in computer technology really changed the picture here, and I'm open to that. But I don't want to make my case for socialism depend on that.
Yeah,
so
sure.
I think that, so I'm perfectly willing to say that maybe we do need to have a private sector for a lot of these things, but that doesn't mean that we need to have a capitalist private sector. In other words, like even if we do need competing private companies and firm failure as an incentive for good performance, that there's always the danger that you go out of business if you're not doing a good job, which, of course, doesn't necessarily, doesn't mean the consequences of that have to be as bad as they are right now. We could have a nice soft welfare state for you to fall back on, right? But you might still need firm failure, right? Then we could have all of that at the same time as we have a private sector that's thoroughly dominated by worker-owned cooperatives. So if you look at real-life examples like the Mondragon Corporation in the Basque Country in Spain, that's been a very successful company, right? It's something like 80,000 members of the cooperative federation, and so it seems clear from this and other examples that you could have a pretty efficient, pretty successful version of a private sector where, and look, you could still, it might very well be that once you get outside of the smallest firms, right? Like maybe if you have like a coffee shop where 4 people work at it or something, then you really can have like direct democracy there. But like once you get outside of examples like that, sure, you probably need managers, right? But they can still be elected managers, and we have seen, and the nice thing about this is that this isn't some like speculative fantasy that, oh, maybe you could organize a company like this. We do have lots of examples of that in the real world under capitalism, and so I don't think that there's any reason to think that, maybe we could say for various reasons, the setup that I'm describing would be at least as a matter of degree less efficient in some ways than what we have now, which might be worth it, right, in exchange for other values, right, that we want to measure it on. But I certainly don't think we have any rational reason to think that it would be like catastrophic economic collapse level inefficient.
What about people who will say that, the people who start businesses should own it and get the rents from those businesses because they took on the risk of opening the business? Most businesses eventually fail. If they succeed, good for them. They should be able to accrue a massive wealth as a result of that. Good for them.
Yeah. So I'd say a couple things. One of them is that I think the risk is often wildly overstated when people make this argument, that you sort of get the impression from the way a lot of people talk about this that the risk that business owners were taking was that, like, if the business went under, they would be sold into slavery or something like that, right? They'd be taken out to after um, the foreclosed sign went up on the shop window, they'd be taken out into the alley and shot. Whereas the actual risk that's being taken in most cases, right, is that you'd be reduced into the working class yourself. That that you would have to having to go work for somebody else. In other words, the risk is being reduced to the level of the people who are working for you. Now, it's certainly true that there's wild variation in cases. That there can certainly be cases where the consequences could be worse than that. But on the other hand, you can have the other way around, like that you can have a case where somebody owns a business because they inherited it, and there's really the risk, the risk of this particular business going under is they'll be less rich, and that's the whole risk. Whereas the people who work for them could face much more severe consequences, because they'd be out of a job. And I'd also point out that, all right, let's say you take out a loan, right? When you're starting the business, I think there's something a little bit misleading about saying that the next 50 years of profit, right, are your due because you took out that initial loan, which has you've recouped many times many times over, right? It's a little bit like saying that that the function of a landlord is to maintain a building, and so that's why they deserve the money that they get in rent. Well, first of all, landlord and maintenance guy are two different functions. Sometimes, if the landlord is small time enough, they'll be performed by the same person, right? But I mean, a lawyer who's cash strapped enough might sweep up his own office rather than hiring a janitor, right? That doesn't make being a janitor and being a lawyer the same thing. And if you want to talk about the work that the owner did, right? And again, some owners do managerial work. Certainly, that's real work. Again, not all, right? Some just hire somebody else to do it. And some owners, like somebody might own a pizza place and be right there with their employees putting pizzas into the oven. But of course, that's not what the profits are for fundamentally. In other words, it's not like these are wages they're being paid to do that work. That these are instead, this is the piece of the pie they can slice for themselves because of their structural power within it. And the structural power would be the same regardless of how they came to own the company, right? Whether it was...
So even in the case of inheritance, right? I think inheritance does pose a challenge to that. I would say, first of all, it's a small challenge, because if you're stupid and you run the company to the ground, then you're going to go bankrupt. On the other hand, I would say that the parents of the person who inherits it are incentivized to start the business because they know that they can pass it on to their kids afterwards, and that makes them work all the more harder in the business. So wouldn't that be a potential challenge to that line of reasoning?
So on the first point, I would say that there are a lot of businesses who have very stupid owners that are doing just fine because the owners themselves, maybe they're just smart enough to know that they shouldn't be managing it, right? That they should hire a professional for that,
or they're lucky, I guess, or they're just beneficiaries.
or they're lucky, right? That could happen. That certainly does happen too, right? But but again, I think there's a distinction that needs to be made between owning and managing, right? Like, these might be done by the same people, just like somebody who owns a business might sweep it up, or they might put pizzas in the oven themselves at the pizza shop. But there's certainly no innate connection between those two things, and there's oftentimes not even a connection in practice, right? Many people just don't do that. Now, it's certainly true that one incentive right? For people who are taking a very hands-on approach to building up, the business that they own, can be passing it on to their progeny and their progeny's progeny, right? That's all true. But I think that it's so. The question is, are we making a descriptive claim or a normative one? In other words, or let me put that a little bit differently. That might be unclear. Are we making a utilitarian argument that, like, oh, this has a good consequence, this is good, that that ownership can be passed down in families in this way, because this creates this incentive that in turn is good for economic growth, maybe, or are we making a principled claim that that because, let's say, if the first person put a lot of work into the business, this means that their family, has a right to it,
I see. Yeah.
in perpetuity. And just real quickly, I would say, on the utilitarian claim, right? Like, I think that the existence of real world worker co-ops that do just fine, right? Is a good counter to that. And on the principled claim, what's deserved, right? Because, like, if grandpa, was a really hands-on owner, he did all this managerial or even, manual labor himself, and he did that precisely because he was hoping that this business, right, would remain in his family, then that means that dad has a right to it, and that means that I now have a right to it. Then I'm fairly unswayed by that, because, of course, even though owners sometimes do some of the work, or depending on the kind of business and the size of business we're talking about, maybe even quite a bit of the work, right? Like, it varies a lot, right? Themselves, most of the work that's done in most businesses isn't done by the owners, right? It's done by other people who are doing it as wage labor. And so, if you're going to say that that you deserve the fruits of this, or you and whoever you designate to have it in the future, or maybe even generations later, we'll get to the point where you have no idea who, but, like, you want it to go through this process, right? That you have a right, even after your death, right, for your wishes to be done as far as who owns it. That's a really strong claim about the relationship between work and the proceeds from that work. And if you're going to make that claim, then I'd say the workers themselves have a better claim, certainly, right? Than, like, that if most of the work being done to build a business or to sustain a business was done by other people, then the people who are currently doing most of the work to keep it afloat, if we're going to make that connection between the work that you put in and then who gets it, right, on the other end, then on that principle,
yeah, I mean, I
maybe,
wouldn't make that connection. I would make more of a connection between the risk you take in the business and your output. But I mean, I think you've already addressed that clearly enough. I'd like to swing gears, though, to a separate question. Essentially, a lot of the concern, I think, for democratic socialists or socialists of any strain is that there's going to be concentration of capital when you have capitalism. And you can see that actually there's been work done on this by people like Thomas Piketty, who is a mainstream economist. I don't think he's a socialist per se. But in a recent Jacobin article, you claim that democratic socialists are aware that power corrupts, and you therefore want to limit the state actors through democratic political institutions like free speech and constitutional constraints. At the same time, you want to expand power to the economic realm. Are you worried about concentration of capital happening if you expand it to the economic realm? And what I mean by that is this. Let's suppose that everybody has a fair share on the capital proceeds. If I'm a worker and I'm completely free to do this, I just want to sell my capital claim or my share to somebody else and retire at the age of 30, 35. What's to prevent me from doing that? And if I do that, then eventually you're going to get that same concentration of capital that you had before, are you not?
Yeah. So I think I heard two questions there. Let me make sure. I've got what you were asking. So I think the
Sure.
first one um, maybe was about like concentration of economic power in the hands of the state, perhaps, right? The bad effects it could have of that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that
Well,
was part of what you're getting at.
in the hands
And
of
then,
anybody, right? It could be a private
yeah.
actor, it could be the state. My concern is just that if you have the system that you lay
Mm.
out, and people
Mm-hmm.
are still completely free to do whatever they want, you
Yeah.
will still end up with that resulting concentration of capital, because workers, if they're free to give up their shares, somebody's
Yeah.
going to buy up those shares, and the person who buys
Okay.
up those shares is
Okay.
eventually going to, as you
Gotcha.
move
All
in
right.
time towards the end of yeah, exactly.
Yep. Okay, I'm clear.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So I agree that if you had a system where even if you started at like you imagine that the beginning is that everybody has that everything is worker owned, and the way the worker ownership works is that everybody has an equal ownership share, but this is a transferable share. You can buy or sell it. Then there's a reasonable suspicion that over time, I mean, probably would take a lot of time to get to the kind of
Yeah.
imbalances that we've got right now, right? But
Hmm.
like you could certainly imagine this, and you could certainly imagine this process leading to a point where you had, if not the kind of imbalances in access to capital that we have right now, at least like more than people like me would want. Right?
Hmm.
That's certainly a fair concern. And my answer would be very simple, which is just I don't think that you should have. I don't think that you should have a market in ownership shares in
Hmm.
market socialism, right? Like I don't think that's something you could have. And one way of getting to why I don't think that is if if the concern, right, is, because like of course this is something we're very used to under the current system. Obviously, not all institutions where everybody has a vote are like this, right? You can't. Um, you can't retire from I don't even know, right? You can't retire from your from the PTA and sell somebody your vote, right? They
Sure. Yeah.
uh, but we're used to economic decision making working this way. But I think for exactly the reason that you outlined, I think even the sort of pragmatic version of socialism I've talked about, I don't think you should have that. And if the concern is, well, this seems like, hey, if this belongs to me, right? I should get to
Yeah.
do with it what I want, including selling it to somebody else. It seems unfair to stop me. Then I would just say that what we have to balance out, right, is any sort of unfairness that you might get there with this restriction on what somebody could do, right, with their
Hmm.
part of a cooperative, against the sorts of unfairness that result when you have concentrations of capital in the hands of some individuals. And so the call I would make is that the latter seems more unfair to me than the former.
Very interesting. Well, you've obviously thought out these positions very well, and we're getting towards the end of our interview. So I'll just ask you, Ben, where can we find you? You're on Twitter, you're on YouTube. Where are you?
Yeah. So Twitter, that's at Ben Burgis, Burgis. And as far as YouTube videos, you can find, well, not just by me, but you can find videos that I do on the Zero Books YouTube channel on Mondays. And you can also see um, videos of my segments on the Michael Brooks Show on that YouTube. Should also mention a podcast called The Dead Pundit Society
Hmm.
that I've been co-hosting. And finally, if you're such a glutton for this stuff that all that isn't enough, that the Jacobin articles and the YouTube videos and everything, Then there's also a Patreon. That's patreon.com/Ben Burgis, where if you want to go support what I do, you can do that. And you, as a gesture of appreciation for that, you get a couple of essays a week there.
Cool. That's awesome. And I'll put links to that in the description below. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been very, very interesting having you on. Thank you, Ben.
All right. Thank you so much.